The problem is you do see a lot of antisocial people succeed. Loneliness is as big a risk factor for ill health and death.
We live inside our heads.
You go cold turkey, you go into withdrawal.
There is a lot of value in the stuff that we struggle with.
Better Thinking. Conversations with experts exploring all things psychology. Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name is Nesh Nikolic, and today I have the privilege of speaking with Professor Dianna Kenny, a distinguished psychologist with over 3 decades of contributions to academia and clinical practice. Dianna completed her professional academic life at the University of Sydney in 2019 after 31 years of service and has now entered full-time private practice as principal at DTK Consulting. In her later career, Dianna became a voice challenging the treatment of gender dysphoria in children and adolescents after reviewing the research relating to increasing rates of diagnoses and affirming care. Dianna published her 12th book in 2024, named Gender Ideology, Social Contagion, and the Making of the Transgender Generation. She critiques what she sees as poor science and advocates for evidence-based approaches over what she refers to as an ideology. I must note up front that this interview is another way of me trying to gain a deeper insight into gender dysphoria. It's a subject that might be tough for some listeners, as it could challenge views they hold personally or in their professional lives. If differing perspectives are likely to upset you, I'd suggest skipping this episode. This is a conversation between two professionals, and it's conducted in good faith to learn and explore a difficult subject. I don't endorse Dianna's views since I haven't thoroughly checked her points. My goal is to simply listen, learn, and build my own take by hearing out various sides. I'm more than open to bringing on other psychologists, psychiatrists, or academics in future episodes who can offer a counter view, like I have done before in the past. So if you do know of an academic or someone who would like to offer a different position, please don't hesitate to let me know. Now that that's all out of the way, let me just say how much I enjoyed speaking with Dianna. I'm excited to share this conversation with you, as I think she's very coherent, very logical, very reasonable in how she puts her position and argument together. And I enjoy delivering that for you today. So let's jump right in. Dianna, big thank you for coming onto the program today. I've been looking forward to speaking with you, as I know you've got a wealth of experience, not just in the topic that we're going to discuss today, but your clinical hat has expanded, across many domains. But thank you for coming onto the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Today's topic is an interesting one, being gender dysphoria in young persons. And I know that this is one that has so many question marks, and the challenge of discussing it is interesting. It can be quite controversial, but it's one that is really front and center of many conversations. So I do appreciate you being willing to discuss this, as it can be a challenging conversation, but I think quite interestingly a clinical one that needs lots of time and a voice to be had. So thank you. Can I start with, how did you get into an interest in the topic?
Well, around about 2017, a colleague rang me and said, "Are you getting any unusual referrals of young people who are claiming that they're transgender and who want to change their sex?" And at that point, I hadn't received any referrals of those young people. And the colleague was a late adolescent adult psychiatrist. And he said, "Look, I'm getting some 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds, and I don't really want to deal with them. It's not my field. And, would you be interested in taking a look?" And I said, "Well, I've never dealt with this situation before." I'd had probably 2 cases of very young children in a very long career of 30 plus years whose parents presented with some gender concerns, but I'd never had any adolescents. So I said, I've got as little experience as you right at this moment, but I'm happy to assess these young people and, see what's going on. And so I took on 2 or 3 referrals at that point and just became incredibly intrigued, puzzled, concerned about what was happening, such that these young people were deciding that they'd been born in the wrong body. And at that point, I just started to do some research, what was out there in the scholarly literature, the clinical literature, that could help me with understanding these presentations. And it's really just gone from there, because there's been an incredible burgeoning of the number of young people presenting in this way. And in line with that, there's been a huge amount of increase in, the gender clinics, which unfortunately attach to a lot of the major children's hospitals. And that's given them a credibility that they don't deserve, because some of these, children's hospitals obviously have a very good reputation, for treating other illnesses and injuries of childhood. And so parents needed alternatives because it became very apparent very quickly that these gender clinics were affirming without doing any adequate assessment. And the situation has remained unchanged, to my knowledge, in the last 10 years. That these young people are demanding appointments at these gender clinics, and within 1 or 2 so-called assessment sessions, they're being referred for either puberty blockade or cross-sex hormones.
Mm-hmm. There's so many questions to ask here. Maybe I can begin with that first response of yours in terms of feeling an intrigue, but also some puzzling experience, and then even some concern. Can you talk me through that? With the experience that you had previously, and obviously this emerging referral base.
Yeah. Yes, the intrigue and the puzzlement had to do with the fact that I'd never seen this presentation before, and I was looking for a clinical framework through which I could understand, this young person. So I've worked in the field of child and family therapy for many, many years, and I started to think about it in terms of a systemic approach or a structural family therapy approach. And I started to really explore what the family constellation of these young people was, and was there anything going wrong in the family such that these young people were presenting in this way. So it was the idea of the identified patient, is there a problem with the family? And this young person is being selected to bring those concerns for help. And I started to view the problem through that lens in the first instance. And so I started to do some quite intensive work with the parents, looking at a whole range of things, the state of their marriage, the family unit, who was in the unit, were their brothers and sisters, only children, and so on. Were the parents separated? Were they amicable, hostile? Was there any other systems that I needed to be thinking about? And one of the key ones was the peer group, because, round about this age, 12, 13, 14, the peer group starts to become more important in terms of fitting in, self-esteem, and so on. And I was looking at whether these young people had experiences of marginalisation, ostracisation, bullying, and cyberbullying. So I just cast a very, very wide net over the entire problem, as well as looking at it from an individual perspective. So what has happened in these young people's early development that could perhaps explain their gender identity confusion? Were there any experiences of sexual abuse? Were there any experiences of dressing up in the opposite gender that has gone a little bit overboard, because quite often young children will dress up, cross-dress, using the play clothes in the dress-up basket, and they get a huge amount of attention from the adults. Look at this, it's so cute. Let's get the camera, take some photos. And interestingly, in my exploration of the scholarly literature, I actually did find some very detailed case studies of where that had actually occurred. Now, obviously, there were other things that had been going wrong, in that young person's life, but that had been a feature. I was also interested in the sibling constellation. If it was a young girl wanting to become male, what did she have brothers? Were the brothers favoured? What was going on with respect to that set of relationships? And then, I was interested in the cultural component, because my research actually took me to different websites where I discovered that different countries have a different approach to this issue. So, for example, Iran allows gender transition as a way of solving homosexuality. So particularly young men in Iran, they face severe imprisonment sentences or death if they're caught in homosexual relationships, and they're given the option of transitioning in order to make them heterosexual. Now, I've heard some Iranian Muslim men deny that that's the case, so I'm not saying that categorically, but let's just say that that's what I've read in more than one place. So there are cultural aspects, social aspects, the ecology of the family and the structural elements of the family functioning, as well as what was going on internally for these young people. So why these young people, even though it was looking like a major element in this whole situation was social contagion, that there were clusters of young people in different schools who were coming out as transgender. And I was interested very much so in that whole social determination of individual behaviour. So it just opened up, an enormous set of hypotheses that I have been trying to test and resolve in the last 7 to 8 years.
It's interesting that this period we have seen an emerging, well, at least it feels like, and I haven't done a deep dive into the literature, but it seems like there's been an increasing number of cases of gender dysphoria. And we know that this is an experience because this is a pattern that has been in the DSM and it's been known for some time, but there seems to be an increasing number. Others might argue to say, no, it's not an increasing number. It's just now being acknowledged, or it's now being allowed to be discussed more publicly. There's more of an acceptance around that. What has your research been, or what have you understood it to be the case? Is there a social contagion effect, or we're finding these clusters are occurring? Because I've heard that, in a similar way of let's say, how eating disorder clusters have occurred in particular, young female populations as well. Not that I've done a deep dive on that, but that's what I've heard. Well, how would you, how do you understand it to be?
Look, there's been many arguments put forward as to why we've seen in some countries a 4,000 or 5,000% increase in young people presenting as gender dysphoric over a very short period of time. So prior to 2010, in most countries, there were very, very few cases, and most countries had maybe one gender clinic for children, for young people. It's only since about 2010 that we really started to see a very steep upward trajectory in the numbers of young people who were presenting. And I know the argument's been put that, we're just so much more accepting and tolerant and, we embrace diversity and so forth. But I really don't think that is the explanation for gender dysphoria, because if you look at other things that were forbidden, let's say, or criminalised in the past, and the two key examples that have been used are left-handedness and homosexuality. So both of them had prohibitions on them. So left-handedness became not a crime, but it was severely punished in schools, and children who were left-handed would have their left hand tied behind their back, and they had to learn to write with their right hand. And one of the reasons for that is that it was happening around the time of the Industrial Revolution, and people were noticing that left-handed people were much more accident-prone in these new factory situations because all the machines were geared to right-handed people. And so in that period of the Industrial Revolution, and where left-handedness was more or less punished quite severely in young children, we saw a very few people who actually got through to adulthood as left-handed. But when that prohibition was lifted, the rates of left-handedness reached an asymptote, which was about 10% of the population, give or take 9 to 11% of the population. And when that prohibition was lifted, that asymptote has not changed, over the last 100 years, 200 years or whatever. It's always remained around a maximum of 9 to 11%. Similarly with homosexuality, when we got all the decriminalised laws and so on, we saw that same thing happening of this rounding out. So the part of it that is accounted for by the loosening of the laws or the repealing of laws that criminalised homosexuality, then more people did feel comfortable about, asserting their sexual orientation publicly. And the counts in census data show that there was this increase. So that partially explains what's happening in the transgender space, but by no means is it an adequate explanation, because we've seen a huge increase in the number of young people coming out as transgender when there wasn't a ban on transgender in the way that there was in homosexuality to begin with. So I think there are much more sinister forces at play here, and I'm not an anthropologist or a sociologist, and I can't argue a very strong case about that. But I think it has to do with the fact that the transgender industry is now worth billions of dollars, and a great number of people have become extremely wealthy. The drug companies providing off-label medications like puberty blockade and cross-sex hormones. So the demand for those drugs has skyrocketed, as has the demand for all sorts of genital surgeries. So there are these surgeons in America who are boasting on their websites that they've done 3,000 and 4,000 genital surgeries on very young people, vaginoplasties and orchiectomies and penectomies and all sorts of, different kinds of so-called gender-affirming surgeries. So a lot of cynical people, and they're perhaps correct in being cynical, are saying follow the money. A lot of people's reputations have been built on being very supportive of the trans lobby. But there are other issues at play. But because I'm a clinician, I'm more focused on which children get caught in the net and why.
And how would you describe what are the conditions in which these numbers have become more prevalent? Like I'm very much like you. In my early career, I haven't heard of even a single case. I didn't study it. Kind of like multiple personality disorder that we used to call it. This is something that's in the DSM, but I've never seen it. I haven't. I think I've had one case that a clinician has spoken about, but that's even questionable. So it's something that did have popularity. It's kind of not around in our clinical experience, or certainly not in mine. And in a similar way, because I don't know much about it, it's very easy to kind of just flow into whatever a narrative is around that. And I think there's a difference between today's narrative about multiple personality disorder. We call it, dissociative identity disorder. We change it, and then I think we keep kind of moving it and going, what is this thing? What is this experience? And I think there's every experience under the sun.
Yeah.
Because there's an individual experience of everything, but sometimes it's in the look, when we start looking at the DSM, we can start query how's this category gone into it, even like homosexuality. How did that get into DSM-3?
Yeah,
that's an interesting one, and I'm sure there's a great narrative to be told around how that occurred and some of the forces at play at the time, and since thankfully been removed. But it's a tough one to understand when so many of us are in the dark, and I'm certainly one of those. There's some logical stuff that I observe. At the same time, there's contradictory evidence that you hear about, and so a lot of us who there's a concern about even discussing the topic, and that's a big problem, and hence why I enjoy trying to lean into the complexities and go, what's going on? How is this coming about? And not to invalidate anybody, but rather to have a clinical and thorough conversation to explore and to try and learn and understand. But I am a little bit confused as to what are some of these things. Social contagion, is it that there's some reinforcement occurring? Is there a celebration around that? Because for some young persons, is it, and there's this beautiful moment that children, young people can be, formed in a particular way, and we do this all the time for all things. Children who are great in soccer usually had a great early childhood in soccer. Likewise pianists and so on. I'm just confused. Yeah, so I'm looking for considerations that we can think about while I try and have some reservation about the different sides that you hear, because there's a lot of contradiction out there at the moment.
Look, I think the example that you gave of dissociative identity disorder, once called multiple personality, is a perfect example of diagnoses gone mad. And, as soon as the diagnosis appeared, psychiatrists were reporting, huge numbers of cases of multiple personality disorder. And, in the height of it, round about the late 80s, 90s, there were surveys of psychiatrists done asking them about their experience with multiple personality disorder, and up to 25% of psychiatrists would say they'd had a case. And yet it's a vanishingly rare condition. So it's a very similar thing. In the DSM 13, it was called gender identity disorder, and the frequency was 1 in 10,000 males and 1 in 27,000 females. Now, if you have a look at the so-called data, which I have, huge concerns about, but if you have a look at the data now, some studies are reporting up to 8% of young people are transgender. But if you look closely at those figures, they conflate gender fluid, gender non-conforming, transgender, and there are lots of young people who are gender non-conforming, who are not transgender and never will be, and they're much more likely to be gay as they move through adolescence and early adulthood. They identify themselves as gay young people. But the research, one has to work through a quagmire of incredibly poor quality data out there, which is supposedly supporting the idea that, transgenderism exists. It's no longer a minority sexual identity. They want to abandon the idea of sex and sexual identity for gender and gender identity. So they're no longer interested in the immutable fact of biological sex, and they're much more interested in the solipsistic notion of gender, which is how you identify, how you perceive your own gender. And however you perceive it, regardless of the sex of your physical body, then that is what you are. And it cannot be challenged. It cannot be, because nobody can argue with your own internal felt sense of whether you are male or female. The irony is, of course, is that the whole transgender movement relies on the binary concept of sex. It's just that they're wanting to reverse it, So they want to get rid of sex altogether, but they can only actually explain gender through the concepts of sex and the dimorphism of sex. So the whole notion of transgenderism is a young person saying that they've been born in the wrong body. And the wrong body is the body of the opposite sex. So they can't get rid of sex no matter how hard they've tried. And their whole foundation, which is so shaky on a number of platforms, is tied up with how science and how common sense has defined, people since recorded time. So that's one big issue. The other big issue is that they don't want to pathologize transgenderism. A young person saying that their transgender is not a psychological disorder as far as they're concerned. It's just a variation of sexual expression or gender expression, and they want to normalize it. But in order to qualify for treatment, you must be suffering from gender dysphoria that is so extreme that you can't function adequately in society until you have your gender dysphoria treated medically. So they want to medicalize an issue that they say isn't even a problem, either a physical problem or an emotional, mental problem. So they're all kind of in a contradictory state of mind over whether this is a pathology or not. And there are all sorts of other kind of dishonesties in the ideology itself. I'll just give you one more. They appropriate intersex to make the argument that gender is fluid. They reject the idea that sex or gender is dimorphic. It's either male, female, or masculine, feminine. They want it to be on a spectrum. And the way they make this spectrum is to say, look at intersex people. They have ambiguous genitalia. Some of them have the genitalia of both sexes. Some of them are indeterminate at birth. And so they're not named until there's more evidence to, decide. And now they're saying that young people should not be interfered with, intersex young people, until they're of an age where they can decide which genital organs to keep, whether they're going to keep their feminine or their female or male organs. So intersex is incredibly rare. It only occurs in 0.02% of the population, and yet the gender ideologists are using this disorder of sexual development as an argument to promote the idea that you can be fluid in your gender. The other thing that is worth noting is that on the one hand, they want fluidity. They want people to be able to pass between the spectrum of masculine, feminine at will. Today I feel male, tomorrow I feel female. And yet part of their ideology is that gender is an immutable, internal sense of being male or female. It's immutable. That's what they say. So which one is it? Is it fluid or is it immutable?
There's so many contradictions that you've raised. You've used the word ideology a few times. Can I double click on that one? Why do you call this an ideology?
Look, a few years ago, I was very interested in religious belief, and I was interested in how faith forms in people and why do some people become fundamentalist. So I wrote a book called God, Freud, and oh, goodness me, I forget the name of my own book, God, Freud, and Religion. And so I looked at the development of religious faith from a Freudian or psychoanalytic perspective, but I also looked at it from the perspective of some of the concepts that I'm now applying to trying to understand this transgender pandemic. And the transgender pandemic resembles a cult in so many ways. And, if you kind of got a blank piece of paper and drew a line down the middle and said characteristics of cult, characteristics of gender ideology, there'd be a very close match between the characteristics. And one of the really sad characteristics is that gender ideology and cults, both of them, try to alienate the young person from their social network, starting with their families. And I've seen countless parents who are just brokenhearted because their children are lost to them. And terrible things happen, like the police would come to their house and remove the child as being a child at risk because the parents would not use their preferred name and pronouns. And all these, glitterati, as we call them, the glitter families, your parents are abusive, you don't have to stay with them, you come and be part of our group and we'll look after you. And after about a week or two of living out of home, all these, transgender supportive people have had enough of this young person, because by this time they're quite damaged. They've dropped out of school, they're, not looking after their personal hygiene, they haven't got work, they haven't got money, they've got nowhere to stay, they're couch surfing. And then it's a downhill, slide from there. But that's one of the characteristics that is quite similar to the cult and the ideology of gender. And there are many others. One is the extreme polarization of views, and you may have seen protests in the street where people are screaming slogans like "trans women are women," and there's absolutely no nuance in their conceptualization of the complexity of this issue. So it's very black and white thinking, which is what you see in cults. There's also a social phenomenon called in-groups and out-groups. And if you can't be a member of the in-group, which is like the mainstream of society, you go and join an out-group, and the out-group then becomes the in-group to those people, and they exclude the mainstream. And so they close around the out-groupness, whatever the characteristics are that brought them together. So it's a very damaging, very dangerous situation that we're in with our young people. And there's just been far too ready an acceptance of an ideology that hasn't been properly scrutinised. And one of the big problems that we don't see with any of the other social contagions that have existed in recent history, and I'm talking about non-suicidal self-injury, eating disorders, suicidality, even, obesity. There's a lot of social contagions, juvenile delinquency and so on. But nobody with any level of intelligence and responsibility has condoned that behaviour, that we don't encourage an anorexic young person to starve themselves to death because that's their internal felt sense of who they are. We don't encourage further self-harm, in young people who are engaging in that kind of behaviour. But all of the institutions that are supposed to protect our young people have fallen in behind the gender cult, the ideology. So we've got the legal system and legislation. We've got all sorts of legislation now banning conversion therapy, which is a complete red herring. We've got the education department telling 5-year-olds that girls can have penises and boys can have vaginas, and they don't have to decide what gender they are until they're ready. Nobody can tell them what their gender is. It'll come to them, which of course is a contradiction to what I said earlier, that, children know immutably what their gender is from a very young age. But But these institutions, the medical profession, are utterly reprehensible. Pediatricians, endocrinologists, GPs, psychiatrists, all of them. You know, if you go and have a look at the websites online, they'll say gender affirming and, you know, the virtue signaling of he, him, her, or, you know, she, her, whatever, in their email signatures and so on. So how is it that these intelligent, educated people, like even the journalists on the ABC, are captured? The Labor Party is captured, you know, the politicians, the teachers, you know, and so forth. Why has that happened? And the only explanation I can come up with right now is it is a dreadful form of moral narcissism, where people would prefer to look good rather than do good. And a prime example of that was a week or two ago, our very own Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Anna Cody, was asked in a Parliamentary Senate's Estimates Committee to define a man and a woman, and she couldn't do it. And Claire Chandler was the person doing the questioning, and she said, do you mean to tell me you don't know what a biological man is? She said, no, I don't have a definition. That's our Sex Discrimination Commissioner. It's almost beyond comprehension that somebody in that position would not be able to provide a simple, clear definition of a male and a female. I have spoken to children's commissioners across Australia, and one of them wanted me to explain what was going on, you know, what's this all about. And so I started to, you know, try to give an outline and put some scaffolding around these notions. And she stopped me and said, just before you go any further, could you please tell me the difference between sex and gender? So here she is with an office full of rainbow flags and trans lives matter and badges and paraphernalia, and she did not understand the most basic concept of transgender ideology. This is what we're dealing with. And children don't have a prayer in withstanding this, because for them, for some of them, it's a form of rebellion. It's a form of expressing profound confusion about their sexuality. There are very, you know, weighty reasons why children are saying that they're transgender and wanting to harm their bodies in perpetuity to prosecute this desire to become a member of the opposite sex.
There's a great challenge as a clinician in this affirming space, because what you mentioned before in using the example of someone presenting with an eating disorder, nowhere in psychology do we say affirm just whatever anyone is experiencing, saying. Now there's a challenge there, because we have to place our own judgment on that and say this is harmful. So there is a judgment. At the same time, it's almost like we're in a world now where we're not allowed to place any judgment on anything. Everything goes and everything's just to be observed, and you can't call anything right nor wrong, good or bad. And it's not from the, you know, the Taoist, perspective of the farmer and the horse story, where we'll see how that comes about. But now we're talking about what could go out and harm a young person. And there's now a question that you've outlined very well about saying, is there a difference between sex and gender? Has there historically been a difference? Is there one now that's being put forward? How do we navigate that? Do we affirm it? Do we not? What's the cost of affirming? What's the benefits of affirming? Because I've spoken with psychologists, I've spoken with psychiatrists from both camps. Those that are in agreement of affirming care, those that are in disagreement of affirming care. The fact that there are centres around and some hospitals that have developed departments or sections, whatever we call them, a service model around that says that there's both, the for clearly, and also there's many that are against, because it's a challenging space. But are these things that you've outlined happening here in Australia? Are these American things? Are they international things? Are they Australian things? When you speak about the education department teaching that there is a choice around gender or sex, and I don't even know, when we start to break human language, I don't know how to even speak about it other than the language that I know. But there's a threat response here about saying, if I use language in the way I know it, will I have a complaint placed against me? And so there's a fear thing going on. And so there's all these caveats in these conversations. I like to just talk about that because I think so many of us experience that. I've heard people in our industry who behind closed doors have had one opinion, but openly would never discuss it. There's a concern. At the same time, we're talking about vulnerable people. That needs support and love and care. And that not just talking about the children, I'm talking about adults, parents, loved ones, people in our profession who are, vulnerable to, you and I are vulnerable. I'm vulnerable to, it takes a whole lot of brain power to read research and actually know whether there's some value in the research or whether it's completely fraught through its methodology or statistical analyses. That's part of the problem. It takes time to do that and say, this is actually nonsense because the methodology is broken.
Well, that's a really good point. Yeah, that's absolutely a good point, because once upon a time, we could trust the scholarly journals to only publish high-quality, peer-reviewed studies. So it could inform the public and other professionals about what is correct. And people have to make decisions about treatment or not treating or whatever. And these are usually based on a body of research work. There was a time, it has softened a little bit in the last maybe couple of years, but in the early days, none of us could get any papers published that was critical of the gender ideology approach. And so there was this huge burgeoning of rubbish research being published and nothing to counteract it, because nobody who was gender critical, as we sometimes call, could get anything published at all.
Why was it the case, Dianna? My apologies jumping in, but I'm curious about that. And how do we know that to be true?
Oh, well, we've all had, very personal experience of that very same thing. And that's why I've been driven to write books. I've just written a book about this very topic that I called Intransigence, Social Contagion, Gender Ideology, and the Scandal of Youth Gender Medicine. Now, it has got me into a huge amount of trouble, as you probably are aware. And I have, experienced a lot of hate and vilification on social media. but also from my own profession. There are chat rooms and psy community. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where psychologists kind of communicate and ask each other questions and so forth. And somebody was asking about, a psychologist experienced in working with gender dysphoric people. And, there was this debate. Somebody recommended me, and then there was this debate about whether I was an ethical practitioner. She's not one of us. She's not ethical because she doesn't believe in gender-affirming care. And then there was another chat room in another society of psychologists that apparently a debate raged about the title of my book because nobody had even read it and they already had opinions about it. So, it's a very risky thing to go against the tide, and you have to go in it with your eyes open. But my outrage over this entire situation has trumped my fear of ostracisation, marginalisation, and so on, and even deregistration. The academic world has as much to answer for as all of these other social institutions that I spoke about earlier, because they're training the new generation of teachers in gender ideology. They're training them to, tell young children in personal development classes, that there's such a thing as transgender and you might be transgender. Or you might be a demi-boy or a demi-girl or pansexual or omnisexual. At one point, there were like 147 categories of sex and gender on surveys. They've cut that out now, but, there was for a few years, you had to put all these categories. Otherwise, you wouldn't get through ethics. You wouldn't be able to conduct your survey if you didn't have 47 categories of gender and sex. It is a very, very fraught situation, and Australia is in the thick of it. There isn't one, maybe I'm exaggerating, there are a handful of politicians who are prosecuting the whole notion of gender ideology in the public sphere, but not hugely enthusiastically. And everybody, as you said earlier, are too afraid to speak up or to be clear that the emperor has no clothes. Gender ideology has no merit. But upon this ideology, thousands of doctors are destroying tens of thousands of lives, and subjecting young people to lifelong patienthood in the name of a cultish ideology that has no scientific merit.
Dianna, you're so clear and well spoken in the way that you present your arguments, and whether I argue for or against, we're just trying to have an open conversation. You've referenced that your registration has, or at least inferred, has been in question, or inferred maybe some complaints or something. Can I ask a little bit about that? Is that something that you've personally experienced? Because what I'm hearing is a very well articulated position. Now, you might be right, you might be wrong, it might be just a conversation, and everyone can just make their own decision. But have you been scrutinized to a point where you've felt your registration has been on the line?
Let's just say there are people out there who wish me ill, and some of them have prosecuted their motivations through official channels. one of which I'm happy to talk about, is the ACT, Human Rights Commission, who were alleging that I was engaging in the crime of vilification because I used the terms social contagion and rapid onset gender dysphoria. They were the examples they gave of my vilifying language. And they also alleged that I was practicing conversion therapy because I don't immediately affirm young people in their belief that they've been born in the wrong body, and I don't counsel parents to immediately take these young people to a gender clinic. So that constitutes conversion therapy. And so, yes, I have been subject to a number of challenging allegations, and I'm not alone. You may have heard of a child psychiatrist in Queensland who has actually had her employment terminated for questioning rapid onset gender affirmation, as I call it, after one or two sessions, to determine whether the child has an innate sense of gender. And, apparently there are members of our profession who can determine that in a half-hour conversation with a young person. So this psychiatrist has been terminated. I have another colleague who made the statement, men cannot breastfeed, and she's in the courts now defending herself against, I believe, charges of vilification. I have another colleague who made the statement that men and trans men should not be playing in women's sport. She actually lost her case, and she was told to pay the complainants $253,000 in damages for her vilification or her vilifying statement that men should not play in women's sport. Australia is a great disappointment in terms of its incapacity to think for itself. And in fact, if you look around the world, there has been a change in position in a number of countries, in particular Scandinavia. All the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, have all reversed their gender policies and, making things available, gender treatment available to young people. As you know, America has had a decree that there will be no new treatments for young people under the age of 18. Britain has closed the Tavistock Clinic amid a huge outcry of immense damage done to children being treated at their gender identity services clinic. Chile has passed national legislation that gender treatments of young people will cease forthwith. So we are seeing some reversals in other countries who have bothered to conduct reputable research and who are now following the results of that research. Australia is in the dark ages when it comes to this issue.
That's concerning to hear, because not knowing enough in this space, I still know enough about the world to say these countries that you have spoken about are not countries that will just willy-nilly make quite considerable changes to their medical model in terms of what is allowed, what's not allowed, the guidance, what research is being used. And to see across the world two significant contradictions, an open conversation is so important to try and understand, how do we help our society? How do we help young people? How do we help family members and the like, understand this because it is very complex. There are some genuine contradictions that you've raised, ones that I've felt. At the same time, there's real nature of all of us wanting to be very compassionate and understanding and caring. I mean, that's probably 99% of humans. Most of us are kind of driven that way. That's how we've continued in evolution. But it's quite concerning that entire medical models in these countries have pivoted toward and then pivoted back. That at least brings about some questions of saying, what was it that they believe in the first instance, in actual fact, pivoted towards, and because that's interesting to unpack, and then to pivot back, and maybe time will tell whether they pivot toward again. But it is very fascinating to say, wow, this is particularly in the Scandinavian countries, because a lot of the world does kind of look up to them in many of their progressive natures of how they run their countries.
Yeah. Look, just to give you an example, in Australia, the Cass Review was commissioned in the UK, and the final version was published in 2024. It was hailed as a significant piece of work that laid out the quality of the research and the conclusions that we could draw from the available research. And to cut a long story short, the Cass Review was very critical of gender-affirming care, and said the research basis upon which it was built was of very low quality, at extremely high risk of bias, and had the capacity to cause immense harm to young people who were, sent along this gender-affirming care path. Australia, in its great wisdom, tried to argue that the Cass Review was not relevant to Australia. Now, how on earth can anybody legitimately lay claim to high-quality international research not being relevant to a particular country, particularly as, ethnically and politically and socially, we are very, very closely aligned with the United Kingdom. We're a country of Anglo-Saxons, and the people who've come here from other countries also have policies in their countries, some of them affirming, some of them not affirming. But we are all more or less human. And so it's such a trite argument that an international piece of research is not relevant to a particular small country, and without giving any valid grounds for making that assertion. On the other hand, the Australian government and the Australian medical professionals have been using what's called the Australian Standards of Care that emanated from the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne under the tutelage of one Associate Professor Michelle Telfer. And she's made very grandiose claims about this Australian Standards of Care, and yet in the Cass Review, they looked at all the standards of care that were available around the world, and the Swedish Standards of Care scored 70 out of 100 or 71 out of 100 on a whole range of different criteria for validity and reliability. The Australian Standards of Care scored 19. And Michelle Telfer is still touting the Australian Standards of Care as if it were the gold standard of treatment in this country, even though it's been rubbished internationally and told it was completely inadequate. It is still being used, and she is still being defended in her use of it. To me, that's not comprehensible. That's not rational. There's something terribly pathological going on amongst our professions dealing with the issue of gender. She was recently sanctioned by a judge in a family court matter for not behaving like an expert witness, but rather behaving like an advocate for one side, which was, of course, the gender-affirming side. So the judge was so outraged by her conduct that he unsealed this case to name her as the expert witness who had misled the court with respect to the dangers of puberty blockade, named her publicly, and yet she has experienced no sanctions whatsoever, no censure, no questioning. But anybody else who, stands up and says, you've made a mistake here, I think we really, really need to think about what we're doing and why we are thinking the way we're thinking and behaving the way we're behaving, are facing all sorts of sanctions.
It's interesting because controversial topics are not always understood as to why they're controversial, other than there are two sides, and that both sides are passionate about their position. It's really challenging when professionals can't speak their viewpoint. Even like what you suggested in terms of a professional saying that men can't breastfeed. Now, I don't know. I don't know if this is a technical possibility or not. I've never heard of it until of recent, but it's really concerning if we can't at least have a conversation. As what I'm supposed to be is a scientist practitioner, and the idea of the scientist practitioner is at least to be able to query, question, debate, have a conversation. Obviously, look at the research. We do want to lean into that. We're not just shooting from the hip and making huge claims, but we should be intrigued. We should be curious. We should be asking these things. And I feel that when it's become controversial, or as you mentioned, some colleagues have had some sanctions placed against them, it kind of says to the rest of the industry, by virtue of what we reinforce, Psychology 101, it kind of says, don't talk about this. I myself have been counseled by a governing body to go out and say you need to have disclaimers in these conversations. So let me put one out there right now. I don't agree or disagree with anything. I'm trying to be curious. I'm trying to be thoughtful. I'm trying to be compassionate about humans, all humans, and also compassionate and thoughtful about those who advocate for and those who advocate against. We need to hear both of them as to why they're passionate. But I think if we place regard for conversation that is clinical in nature, and people debate it, that's really important. We kind of have to say, how do you know that? How is this true? And someone should be able to come and say the CAS review is incorrect. Fair enough. That's a different opinion. What I should go out and do now is go and read the CAS review myself, rather than just say, no, Dianna said so, because I'll get someone else say that the CAS review is absolutely correct, and anyone that argues against it is incorrect. The friction of being human, the friction of being human is the challenging part. Is that kind of like ChatGPT, Grok? We just believe whatever it says now, and in there is a problem. We're not being scientist practitioners and querying it and saying, "Are you sure?" And I shouldn't be asking the program, "Are you sure?" because it tends to spit out the same response. I need to go out and vet it myself, and that's what this conversation is about. Because I've heard both sides. And yeah, this is a real concern because I can see some real great challenges in how we traverse this, and I can see that because my colleagues and I don't know how to speak about it. We,
Yeah.
we're either overly passionate about it or we make huge generalizations. We haven't picked up the research to say so. This is kind of like the problem we have with even following our own code of ethics. We assume the code of ethics says something rather than picking it up and reading it and trying to understand what does it say in black and white, and so we have this bias, confirmation bias in whichever direction we lean. It's complicated.
It certainly is, yes.
If people want to find out more, how can they go about continuing this conversation? What are some resources that you would encourage listeners to read, to watch, to do their own research in? How can we continue that conversation that goes beyond today?
Well, there are a couple of very reputable organisations and websites for people who don't want to delve into the medical literature. And one of them is called the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, SEGM for short. And if you just Google SEGM, it will come up. And there's a wealth of summaries of all the major reviews on gender affirming care. So you don't have to wade through like 200 pages of the original document, but you can get a 10-page summary in plain English about what the findings are. So that would be a very good place to start if you're interested in understanding the evidence base for and against. It tries to be very even-handed. It presents things in a very dispassionate way. So I'd really recommend that site. And there's another organisation called GenSpect, GenSpect. And there are organisations in Australia and New Zealand and around there's organisations, GenSpect branches in different countries. They've also got a wealth of information. I've just published a book on the subject, and in the back of that book, I have listed about 40 organisations that are operating in this space of gender identity and gender dysphoria. And a lot of them are very good in terms of providing facts, figures, the latest legislation, the latest critiques, systematic reviews, and so on. And some of them are very good for providing statistics that you would otherwise never be able to obtain yourself. So if you're looking for facts and figures and surveys and census data, it's very good. There are some very good ones for that. And interestingly, the insurance data is probably one of the most accurate sources because they're paying for these gender services, so they know how many prescriptions were written for puberty blockade or cross-sex hormones. They know how many double mastectomies have been conducted on minors in the last 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. So just to get a handle on the depth and scope of the problem, going to some of these websites is very useful.
Wonderful. Can I just get the title of your book as well?
Yeah.
That you've published for listeners to consider as well?
It's called Intransigence, Gender Ideology, Social Contagion, and the Scandal of Youth Gender Medicine.
Before I let you go, because I know I've already taken up a lot of your time, how is informed consent covered off in interventions that have, the very real potential of harm if they're given to, quote unquote, the wrong person, or, how are we vetting for these things if we do a double vasectomy or, puberty blockers that, from my understanding, they do have a potential of creating infertility, is what I've been told. How do we do informed consent? And please correct me if I've gotten any of that wrong.
No, look, it's a very, very good question, and it's a very fraught question. Adults tend to engage in what, is called cognitive laziness, and they jump on bandwagons of slogans to pretend that they fully understand the complexities of an issue when they really don't. And what they've jumped on in terms of informed consent is this concept of the mature minor. Now, a mature minor, might appear at first glance to be a contradiction in terms, and that's because it is, but of course it's not recognised as such by the people propagating this notion that young people who've had no life experience of sexual intercourse, childbirth, parenting, some of them are still struggling with their sexual orientation. They've had no life experience whatsoever, but they are mature enough to make a decision to sterilise themselves, to subject their bodies to off-label potent medications that have lifelong effects on them, and to agree to particular surgeries like double mastectomies. Apparently, 15 and 16-year-olds can be deemed mature minors such that they can agree to these kinds of interventions. It boggles the mind how a mature and ethical adult can come to such a conclusion. But in fact, the people propagating this atrocity on a generation of young people are not mature, and I seriously suspect not very intelligent, because a couple of years ago, a journalist actually accessed the WPATH files, the World Organization for Transgender Health, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. And this journalist was able to hear what they were discussing on an international forum and then published it. And it is really, really worth listening to. It is so chilling in the ignorance and the confusion that these people have about what they're doing. And they even went so far as to say that desisting, regretting, and detransitioning are all part of the gender journey. And the young person has to own every station along the way, including, profound regret and disturbance for having damaged their body irreparably at a very young age. So they don't even take responsibility for what they do. One of the propagators of this affirmation model is a person called Joanna Olson-Kennedy. And she has said that if a young girl gets a double mastectomy, it's no problem. She can just go and get a new pair if she wants, referring to breast reconstruction or implants or whatever. This is the callousness and the flippancy with which these people are dealing with young lives. So
there's real medical evidence to say the opposite, that it's not just about you cutting off parts of your body that don't have a form and a function, not just for breastfeeding, but for other health aspects as well. That's concerning. Yeah. Incredibly concerning. What's really fascinating, and I'm one of those silly, foolish people as well, because I've never even thought about this concept of mature minor. What a ridiculous term. When you actually examine it, it's going out and saying no one wants to put a line down in the sand and say, when is something okay and when's it not? So we're just going to create this gray space that we know sadly is going to attract the worst common denominator to abuse. You know, we just kind of do that in all legislation. You have to keep kind of change it because you're basing it on the lowest common denominator of how someone going to attack the system for their own benefit. We don't have a question about that when it comes to young people having sexual intercourse, do we? We go and say there's a real clear line, I think. You can't have a person of a mature age having sex with an underage person. But a mature minor, even that whole concept, we don't do it in reverse. We don't say an immature adult, young adult, or whatever the opposite of minor is, and go, well, they can't consent because they're immature, even though they've gone over the chronological age. We don't do that one. Well, unless there's obviously, very severe, intellectual disability. But that's so fascinating. I've never thought of mature minor, yet we do that in psychology with, you can start to give consent if you're 16 plus and you're kind of mature and the psychologist decides that. But yeah, there's a lot of question marks around that. Not having a guidance that is clear starts to open up many concerns about how that could be abused by others or the young person themselves.
Yeah.
Gosh, I've learned so much. I wish I could have so much more time with you, Dianna. I appreciate your time, but you're clear and well formulated ideas. It's very intriguing. I think there's some braveness around you discussing this topic because it is a prickly topic. I myself feel a little bit anxious about this conversation. Historically, even having someone like yourself on to discuss this has created a concern. Once again, disclaimer: I'm just interviewing. These aren't my opinions. I'll leave it. I'll leave that there. But some great places to continue this conversation, and I hope I can also have someone on the other side on the podcast that can go out and say, "Let me explain to you why firming care is the gold standard and why we need it." I think it's just important that we have the conversations, and thank you for articulating your position and your concerns and the contradictions and the like. I wish you all the best, and your passion definitely is oozes out, and that's what's exciting for me to talk to people who have done really comprehensive research and talk about topics with great passion and love, because I think that's how we learn. We don't have to agree, but we can go out and consider, or we can reject it as well and just say that Dianna, she's got the wrong message. She's not reading it correctly, and that's fine as well. But Yeah, so much that I've learned and I haven't thought about historically in the past. So thank you for imparting your knowledge, in this small little moment of opportunity to chat. So thank you.
Thank you so much.